ever been in front of a camera when the flash went off and you were blinded for a moment by the flash and, just you couldn't really see anything or, affected your eyesight? And I think when I think about that, I think that this is the way sometimes we encounter difficulties in life, right? We're blinded by a problem that seems overwhelming to such a degree that we don't know what to do. We can't see past the problem or the challenge because it's overwhelming. And I think that happens to us all at one time or another. And I think the question for our lives in that moment, the spiritual question is what do we do after we're blinded by a problem? How do we face it? How do we overcome it? What do we do when we face giants, so to speak, in our lives? And this morning, our scripture reading, we continue in the book of 1 Samuel, looking at the stories of the transition that was taking place in ancient Israel, and the encounter of the introduction of David, a biblical character that is a large part of ancient Israel history, King David. And this story is the third introduction we have to King David, the story that we're going to hear. It's a well-known story. I'm sure you've all have heard about David and who? Goliath, right? And we often think about what? It's a story of what? The little guy beating the big giant. And it is a story about that, but it's so much more than just that rooting for the underdog kind of story. It's much more than that. And this is the third, as I said, the third story introducing David in the biblical text. And in the first two stories, David basically is passive. But as we'll hear in this story, King David is very, very active. And so we're going to begin. And I've asked Brady and Frankie, who are you going to be?
I'm the Israelite.
Oh, you're the Israelite reader. And you're the David reader. And I'm the Philistine reader. I don't know, you're bigger than me. No. All right. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Sukkah. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together."
When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up and out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
So Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth."
But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw and from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine.
So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them.
Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to this Philistine.
The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field."
But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand."
When the Philistine drew near to meet David,
David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground.
thank you, Brady and Frankie, for sharing in the scripture reading. That's a long scripture reading, so it's good to have different voices. If you have a pencil or a pen or a writing utensil, I give you permission to doodle during this sermon. You might want to draw a windstorm or something on your bulletin, and you might want to begin reflecting or thinking about any giants that you're facing in your life. Or maybe you have something that you're afraid of that you want to draw. You could draw a loopy storm, like in this picture here, like a loopy storm like this young person did, and you could write down the things maybe that you're afraid of or the giants that you fear, like maybe like the boy here, he was afraid of big dogs or the night or being all alone. So think about that throughout the sermon, because we all face giants at one time or another, and I believe every person here probably is facing a giant. It may be a debilitating disease, maybe a looming reality of the death of a loved one, could be difficulties with children, difficulties with adult children, could be financial burdens, could be a business situation that keeps you up at night. It could be an addiction that seems to have you in its grip. It could be hostility from an antagonist, difficult work environment, an unexpected tragedy. We all face difficulties. We all face giants in our lives as individuals and as a community of faith. A post-Christian culture is a giant. We face the growing giant of white Christian nationalism. That's another giant that is out there. And we face growing giant of anxiety and fears stoked by those who seek to gain or keep power. All of us, whether we follow Jesus or not, we face what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the triple giants or the triple evils of racism and militarism and poverty. Those are still with us. And in our scripture text this morning, the Israelites faced a giant. But they couldn't overcome that giant because they wouldn't admit they were facing one. Now, how could they not know about Goliath? They knew about Goliath. Every day he came out for 40 days and he taunted them and he challenged them. And he said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." But Saul and the Israelites were bound by fear. We're told that they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The King Saul, who was anointed to be the one to deliver Israel from the threat of the Philistines, is paralyzed by fear. He's not even willing to acknowledge the giant they're facing. He doesn't respond. They're in denial of their situation. When we face giants in our lives, denying there is a problem or allowing the giant to paralyze us with fear is not the solution, of course. Rather, admitting we're facing a giant is the first step to overcoming that giant. Admitting we're facing a giant is the first step to overcoming that giant. The big book of AA puts it this way in step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and you could replace any other giant in your life, over anger, over drugs, over other people, over those who hurt us, and our lives had become unmanageable. Admitting we're facing a giant is the first step to overcoming. What giants are you facing in your life this morning? Again, permission to doodle. We now jump to verse 19 and 20. And here we are introduced to King David, or David, not yet. He's not king yet. He's a boy. He's been anointed in the earlier story that we heard last week. And he's been sent by his father, right, to go up to the army to bring some provisions to his brothers. And while he's there, he hears the taunts of Goliath. Now, just an aside, I want you to know that in the Bible itself, there are other texts that say that someone else killed Goliath. Did you know that? Were you aware of that? There's some discrepancy over who actually killed Goliath. So it raises the question that maybe this isn't necessarily, a factual, historical story of a battle report, but maybe it's teaching us some theological truths to apply to our lives. Because I always want to be careful with this story because it's such a well-known story. We love to tell children, but I think it sometimes, if we're not careful, it can go into that narrative of glorifying violence that we have in our culture, right? And in fact, the narrative proclaims a different message than that when you listen to the narrative of the story. But in this text, David hears the taunts of Goliath. And again, the Israelite soldiers respond with fear. But David leaves the provision in charge of the keeper of the baggage. Kind of funny because in an earlier story, a few chapters before, King Saul hides in the baggage. But David leaves the provisions with the baggage, and then he goes, and he asks his brothers, and he asks the other soldiers, he says, "Who is this? Who is this that has come up to defy Israel?" And David asks, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine?" And he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David becomes the first in the text to describe this confrontation in theological terms. He's the voice that describes it in theological terms. He sees what Saul and the rest do not see. He sees that to respond to the Philistine on their terms, trusting in the force of arms, leaves them in fear. But David doesn't live in fear because his arsenal is different. His arsenal is open to powerful and unexpected resources for life. Not only is his arsenal different from Goliath's, but it is different from Saul and the Israelites as well. So he goes up, he's brought, Saul hears his words that he speaks to the others, and he's brought before Saul, and David says to him, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." But Saul said to David, "You're not able to go. You're just a boy. You're just a boy." And he's been a warrior from his youth. How does David respond? Well, he tells stories from his youth, right? And he speaks about how he was a shepherd to his father's flock. And that whenever a wild animal, a lion or a bear, would come and take a lamb from the flock, he would go after it, strike it down, and rescue the lamb from its mouth. And he would strike it down and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears. And he says, this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. In retelling how God saved him from the paw of the lion and the bear, David provides a second step to overcoming the giants of our lives. And that step is to remember God's past faithfulness, God's past actions. Remembering is powerful. I like the humorous story that Fred Craddock tells of facing a giant when he was baptized at 14 years of age. He says he knows the minister was saying a lot of wonderful things about being buried with Christ and all of that. But all Fred was thinking about was, do I hold the handkerchief? Does he hold the handkerchief? I wonder if it's cold. I bet it's deep too. He reflects. He says, I'm having all these thoughts, and the minister is saying, you're buried with Christ. And he says sometimes it just seems that we learn things afterward, that it's in reflection and in memory that we come to see and understand God's faithfulness and God's presence to us. In today's scripture, it is David who has that memory, right? It is therefore David believing in the living God. Right? David remembers that it was God who brought them up, what? Out of Egypt. It was God who delivered him from the hand of the paw of the bear and the lion. David is practicing the faith of Israel that Saul and Saul's troops forgot. So remembering and believing in the power of God is the second step to overcoming giants in our lives. Again, to refer to the big book of AA, they say it this way: we came to believe in what? In a power greater than ourselves that could restore us to sanity. Now, as a result of David's speech, Saul is finally able to echo David's faith. And what does he say in response? Saul said to David, go, and may Yahweh, may the Lord be with you. So Saul is finally able to utter the divine name, but what's he not able to give up on? He's not able to give up on his trust in military power. So what does he do? He puts a bronze helmet on David's head. He clothes him with a coat of mail, straps him with a sword. And David tried to walk in vain because he was not what? Used to them. Saul still doesn't understand. Walter Brueggemann says, Saul wants to outdo Goliath on Goliath's terms. He puts on the same instruments of war that the Philistines use. He puts those same instruments of war onto David. But what does David do? He rejects them. I cannot walk in them, for I am not used to them. Rather, David takes the same instruments that he had as a shepherd, his slingshot and 5 smooth stones. And he goes out to meet the giant. And the Philistine comes out and he taunts him, right? Am I a dog that you come out to me with sticks? But David responds to his taunt. You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And he goes on to say, this very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine armies, so that what? So that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by what? Sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's. I think Jesus said something along those lines when he said, those who live by the sword will what? Die by the sword. David is courageous because he trusts not in superior weapons or training, but because he trusts in the surprising possibilities of God's deliverance. He's the one who has trust that there are resources beyond the technology and powers of kingdoms. He offers an alternative way. Now, it's not pacifist. He's still got his slingshot and his 5 smooth stones. But it's a different way that subverts self-serving power. His faithful and truthful speech calls Saul and Israel away from imitating the nations and calls the nations away from the defiance of God. See, David turns his will and his life over to the care of God as he understands God. The third step, recognizing the battle belongs to God. And that our job is to stay close to God. David turns his life over to God, knowing that it is the Lord who saves. It is the Lord who saves. Of course, what happens, as you know, the story finally builds to the crescendo. The Philistine draws near. David takes out the stone, slings it, and strikes the Philistine on his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. This was the story, originally for Israel and now for the church, for you and me, that shows us how to live when we are facing giants. The lesson is that we can trust the living God. We can admit that in our own human resources, we may be powerless over the giants of our lives. We can come to believe in God and God's power, that God's power is greater than those giants, greater than the storms of our lives. And we can make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to God instead of continuing to trust in human powers. Instead of trusting in the power of military might or violence, we can trust in the living God. Such confidence in God empowers us to speak faithfully and truthfully, like David. Such faith in God empowers us to courageously confront the giants in our lives. Such faith empowers us to believe that a well-placed stone might prove superior to the armor of Goliath or Saul. Such confidence allows us to engage in the spiritual practice of being open to new understandings about our world, our lives, and even of the Bible and our God. Such faith empowers us to reconsider our fundamental belief in the power of coercion, force, and violence as means to secure our future. Such faith invites us to consider an alternative way. Donald Barnhouse served as the pastor of the 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. About 12 years after he graduated from college, he was invited back to preach in the chapel service of his college. When he arrived, he noticed one of his old professors had taken a place near the front to hear him. When the service was over, his old professor came up and said, "If you come back again, I won't come to hear you preach. I only come once." And he said, "I am glad that you are a big godder." A big godder. When my students come back, I come to see if they are big godders or little godders. And then I know what their ministry will be. Barnhouse asked him what he meant. He said, "Well, some people have a little God, and they are always in trouble. God can't do any miracles or solve the problems around them. They have a little God, and I call them little godders. Then there are those who have a great God. God speaks, it happens. God stretches forth God's hand, and miracles occur. God shows God's self strong on behalf of those who stand in awe of him." And he said to Barnhouse, "You have a great God, and God will bless your ministry." In our story today, David had a big God. Do you?